Hi there, welcome to Lilly-Tree. Today we're making this music-inspired wire wrap pendant, and if you want to see more techniques and tutorials like this one, hit that subscribe button. Now let's get wrapping. To make this, we're using 1mm diameter copper wire, which is 18 gauge, 0.25mm copper wire, which is 30 gauge, 3 top drilled drop beads, and some small 2mm beads. And I'm using the 0.25mm wire because it'll fit through those drop beads twice. And the tools we're using are bell making or round nose pliers, chain or flat nose pliers, wire cutting pliers, and an awl. We're going to start by securing each of the beads on a piece of the thicker wire. And I'll start with the bead that's going to be the lowest. I have 20 centimetres or 8 inches of wire here. And I want to bend it about 7.5 centimetres or 3 inches from one end. I'm taking it around my bell making pliers because I want to make a circle that the bead will fit into. We'll check that the bead fits nicely. And then carefully bend the wire ends upwards. And you want to make sure the longer end will be on the outside of the pendant when it's woven together. I'll adjust that hoop to 90 degrees and then just check again that the bead will fit nicely. We're now going to take the 0.25mm or 30 gauge wire. And I've got 1.5 meters here to weave the rest of the design too. I'm going to start about 20 centimetres in. And just coil it around that hoop. And we'll wrap around that loop until we've gotten halfway. We'll then thread on the bead. Taking those wire ends in opposite directions through that bead. Then we can carefully pull to tighten it up and sit it in place. We'll then continue wrapping around that hoop. Using each of the wire ends on both sides. Until we get to the point where they meet. That's the first bead secured, and we'll do the same for the other 2 beads. You'll notice that the centre wires are a bit shorter. I started with around 15 centimetres of wire for that. And the other bead has the longest wire on the outside, the other side. I've also used smaller lengths of the 0.25mm wire for the other 2 beads of around 30 centimetres or 12 inches, as we won't be using those for weaving the design, but we might need some short tails later. We're now ready to start weaving the design, and we're going to start with that lowest bead. Because we want the beads to sit in a diagonal upwards, we've got those first 2 wires that we need to weave before we start linking the sections together. So we'll take that first section, and using the long tail of wire, we're going to wrap over both of those base wires 3 times. We'll then take that weaving wire through between them and wrap just the short base wire 3 times. Then we'll wrap over both wires again 3 times. And we'll continue wrapping 3 times over both wires and 3 times over the single wire, up to the point where we want to add in that second section. And I'm finishing with the wraps on both wires and then the wire coming through between them. Now we'll add in that second section, and I want the bottom of the bead to be just a little higher than the loop, so they're not touching. Then I'm going to wrap over the 2 centre wires. That's the original short wire and the wire next to it that we've just added in. And I've wrapped that 3 times. Then take the weaving wire up between them and wrap over the 2 new wires 3 times. We can then take the wire between those and wrap back over the 2 centre wires 3 times. And for the rest of the weave, we'll be always wrapping over 2 wires in sets of 3. Then taking that weaving wire up between them and moving over to the next 2 wires. In this case, it's those outside 2 wires again. To start with, when adding each new section, it will waggle about a little bit, but as we continue the weave, that'll fix it in place and it'll be more and more solid. Once we've wrapped those outside 2 wires, we take the weaving wire up between them and then wrap those centre 2 wires again. We're basically wrapping in a zigzag design. So we just move across 1 wire each time, wrap over 2, and then move across again. Once we get to the edge, we'll take the weave back across. And we'll continue that weave up to where we want to add the final section. We've woven across towards the middle of the pendant, so now it's time to add in that final section. And we'll weave over the last base wire of the previous section and the first base wire of that new section that we're adding in 3 times as before. Then up between them and wrap 3 times over those 2 new wires. Then we'll take the weaving wire up between them and back over the 2 wires that are the inside wire of the new section and the last wire of the previous section. Then through between them and across to the next 2 wires. This is exactly the same as we were weaving before, it just extends that zigzag across the full 6 wires. Once we've woven across to the edge, we'll wrap those end 2 wires 3 times Take the weaving wire through between them and then wrap over the next 2 wires along to weave the zigzag back again. And you can continue this weave to make the pendant as long as you want. We're now ready to make the bail, and I'm going to be using my bailing pliers to keep each of the loops the same size. I want to leave the length of the outside 2 wires, but I'll trim those 4 inside wires. And turn a loop in the end of each of them with my second step of my bail making pliers. You can make these loops as large or as small as you like. But make sure they all line up. And try not to push the previous loops out of shape as you make the next one. So they all sit neatly next to each other when you're finished. For the outside wires, we're going to turn the same loops, but because we're leaving the end tail, we'll move that to the outside of the pendant. We'll do that with both sides. Then we can make sure we've got all of those loops in a line. And that's what will act as our bail. So we're now ready to make the embellishment. We're going to use those outside wires. So the first thing I want to do is bend them outwards from the pendant. We're then going to swirl these around, and you can do whatever design you like. But I'm going to create a curve outside of the weave. Then I'm going to make a little loop with my round nose pliers that I can sit one of those small beads in. Keep that wire coming round. And just make the adjustment so it's sitting where you want and is the size and shape that you want. Then I'll continue curving that wire down and I'll sit it above the centre bead, finishing in another little loop. Then for the other side, I think I'm just going to bend that around. I'll take it under the other embellishment wire and then bend it around that wire so it holds it and keeps it in place. I'm going to make a full loop on that second wire. I'll trim it a bit just to help get it in place. Finish that loop off. Trim it. And then move the end so it's sitting over the rest of the wire. Then I'll finish that end, trim it off, make sure that loop's flush. Now I need to secure those embellishments, but I'll do that whilst I'm adding the beads. I want to add a bead in that little gap right at the top of the pendant. So we can take the weaving wire from where the weave finished and just coil it down the embellishment wire up to where the bead will sit nicely in the gap. We can then thread on one of those beads. And take the weaving wire through between the base wires of the pendant. We'll make sure that bead's sitting where we want it. And then wrap that weaving wire 3 more times around the wires to secure it. We can then trim it off so it's flush. I'm now going to put another one of those beads in that loop that we made. And for this I need to secure another piece of the weaving wire. So we'll take it through the frame, and we can use the awl to create enough gap between those base wires. I'm just taking it around one of the wires that's sitting underneath where that loop is. And we'll wrap it 3 times to secure it. And then take the wire through and through that loop. I'm going to take it around the embellishment wire in that loop once, so it will hold that loop in place. Then we can add the bead. And we could take that wire back down and secure it to the base frame again, but I'm just going to wrap it around the other side of that loop a few times. Then we can trim off the excess. Now I've just got one more bead to add and that bottom loop to secure, which I can do with one of the tails of wire from securing those drop beads. So we've got all of these other tails of wire I can now get rid of. Normally I'd leave them on till right at the very end, just in case I decide to add another bead somewhere or do some more embellishment. But I'll trim them off now as it's a little bit easier to see what I'm doing. So we'll take that wire up through that loop. And then around the loop to help secure the loop in place. We'll then add the bead and take that weaving wire back down. I'm going to take it once through to the back of the frame just to help secure it a little bit more. And we can finish it off by wrapping 3 times on that loop. And our pendant is finished. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and head over to my website for more hints, tips and projects. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon.